I can remember clearly why I wanted to become a photographer, because I was flipping through a copy of Paris Match looking for pictures for the Tour de France, and I came across a photograph by Henri Cartier-Bresson, very famous picture, boy with 2 bottles of wine, Rue de Mouffetard, 1954. I was so mesmerized by it, and I couldn't stop looking at it. It stayed in my brain for the rest of my life, this picture. My first major body work was in the Isle of Man, which is where I'm from, an island between Ireland and England. I went there very purposefully to photograph the place I knew and loved. It was strange. When I knocked on somebody's door, they would say to me, well, I know your father and your mother, but who's your grandmother and who's your grandfather? And I would explain who they were. My grandfather was a miller in Laxey. My grandmother was a hill farmer in Cronkervoddy. My mother was a Cronkervoddy quirk. When they heard all that, they were satisfied that I was okay for me to photograph them. And it was kind of interesting that if you know somebody's father and mother, then you know them in a certain way. My father owned a pub in the Isle of Man, and the pubs were shut on Sunday. So every Sunday, we as a family would go with him in the car to different sites in the Isle of Man, archaeological sites, old churches, look at farmhouses which he thought were interesting. And so I got to know the Isle of Man very well. I absorbed it. I absorbed the idea of this ancient culture, looking at Neolithic burial sites. If you went into a Neolithic burial site in the Isle of Man and could dig somebody up and get the DNA, I'd share some of it. It's kind of strange. You know, so you did feel very identified with that place. It was such a stronghold. After the Isle of Man, I knew that how important it was that people knew me before I started photographing. So when I went anywhere to photograph, I often went into a community and didn't photograph for a while, but just hung out and talked. And sometimes communities were very difficult to get into because they didn't like strangers. They didn't know who I was, and there was no reference for me. It would take time for people to accept you, and you coming back all the time, coming back. Not disappearing on them, but coming back. And so they got to have some confidence in you. And sometimes you find allies within the community who took a shine to you, liked you, and helped you. This was the case in Skinner Grove, where I was befriended by a young man who was actually the leading younger fisherman. His name was Lezo. Very adventurous guy, smart as a whip. When people that say, who's he, what's he doing here? Lezo would just say, oh, he's all right. And that endorsement was enough. And I was eternally grateful for Lezo for stepping up for me. And slowly people did start to get to trust me. Trust is very important. The person you're photographing has to trust you. They don't have to, but it's much better if they trust you. It just makes all the difference. In many ways, if you befriend people and you know more about them, and by that time, they know a lot more about you, they become friends. And we talk about things, And that's the way I can go forward with photographing, when you have that amount of trust. Joseph Kadelka was staying with me once in, I can't even remember, in 1975. And we talked about me and what I was doing in Newcastle. And he said he thought it was very important that I didn't leave Newcastle, that I stayed in the same place. If you stayed in the same place year in and year out, you'd get much better chance of getting under the skin of the place and dropping more of your prejudice about what you thought the place should be as opposed to what it is. And it takes time to reach that thing, to accept what it is, and to be able to embrace the contradictions of the place, the things that contradict your already formed opinions, And he said, it's important to stay. Stay, he said, stay here, stay. And so I was there for 15 years. It's always been practical for me to work in black and white. I'm old, I'm 74 now. So when I started photographing for myself, 50 more or more years ago, black and white was the dominant thing anyway. So I went along with that, and then I got versed in how to photograph in black and white. Then I've always had my own darkroom, my own printing setup. And black and white is an abstraction of reality. When you're looking at a black and white photograph, you remove yourself from reality and you look at this distillation of reality, this interpretation of reality, which is in black and white. And somehow, I think, you can see that reality more clearly. I'm known mainly because I photograph working class people, often people who are not in work, who've fallen out of work, and small communities. I'm very proud that I'm photographing them, that I'm recording their lives, that I'm valuing their lives. I'm not an historian, and these people will never appear in history books because ordinary people don't. History is done to them. It's not acknowledged that they make history. With hindsight, what I photographed in the northeast of England was the de-industrial revolution. It was the end of industry in the northeast. The shipyards that I photographed have gone, they disappeared, and there's no sign of it. On the river, you would have no clue where these great shipyards were that built these enormous ships. Gone. But they're not gone. I photographed them. They existed. People spent their lives here. You know, and it's worth recording. When you're photographing, you're not thinking consciously in that moment that this photograph is a moment in history, that you're recording a moment in history, when in fact you are. You're not thinking that the photograph of this person that you're taking is a chronicle of a death foretold, which inevitably it is. Photography's relationship to memory is complex. Can memory ever be made real? Or is a photograph the closest we can come to sometimes making it seem real?